Start. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to all of our returning members and all our new members. This is the organizational meeting of the Committee on Oversight and Reform for the 117th Congress. For this meeting, I would like to proceed as follows. First, Ranking Member Comer and I will introduce our new members on each side. Next, I will introduce the Vice Chair of the committee. Third, we will introduce our subcommittee chairs. And finally, we will officially adopt the committee rules and officially name the subcommittee chairs and vice chairs. So with that, I will now introduce the new majority members of the committee. First, we have Congressman Danny Davis from Illinois, who is actually returning to the Oversight Committee after a brief absence. Next, we have Congressman Hank Johnson from Georgia. And last but not least, we have Congresswoman Cori Bush from Missouri. I now yield to Ranking Member Comer to introduce our new Republican members.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I'm honored to be the ranking member of this committee and look forward to working alongside of you this new Congress. Because this is the first time our committee's coming together, I'm glad to have an opportunity to, in addition to announcing our new members, but say a few words. First, I want to welcome all our returning members from last Congress and also welcome back the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions. I want to welcome Pete back to the Oversight Committee, and most importantly, the new Republican members on the committee. They hail from all parts of our great country, a very impressive, very diverse group of freshmen that I'm sure we'll all enjoy working with. Let me begin with Andy Biggs from Arizona, Andrew Clyde from Georgia, Nancy Mace from South Carolina, Scott Franklin from Florida, Jake LaTurner from Kansas, Pete Fallon from Texas, Yvette Harrell from New Mexico, and Byron Donalds from Florida. Welcome to the Oversight Committee, which is, in my opinion, the very best committee in Congress. The committee has many opportunities to make government work for the American people, to ensure that taxpayer dollars are not being mismanaged, abused, or wasted, to shine a light in the darkness of the federal bureaucracy to prevent corruption and self-dealing, and to make sure our federal government is working efficiently for the American people. We're glad you all are on the committee and look forward to working with each and every one of you this Congress. And hopefully, very soon, we will be able to have all of you in our committee hearing room in person. As the chairwoman knows, I've repeatedly requested that we move toward in-person hearings this Congress. I thank her for listening to and acknowledging these requests. Still, we're holding this organizational meeting with all of us staring at each other through computer screens. We have been elected by our constituents, the American people, to represent them in their interests. To properly do so requires us to regularly convene in person to conduct our official committee business, including hearings, markups, and floor votes. Many of our constituents, including thousands of my own, get up every day and leave their homes to do their jobs, whether they're jobs in a hospital, doctor's office, grocery store, restaurant, post office, and so forth. They show up. Yet we're unwilling to do the same. We must show up in person and serve those same people on the front lines during this pandemic. While I understand the COVID pandemic has presented many challenges for all of us, we still have been elected to do a job. We're fortunate that we can do so safely. And thanks to the attending physician's office, we have testing, we have access to vaccines, and we can safely meet in our committee room as we did this summer before we had testing and vaccines. And my colleagues and I will be continuing to make this very reasonable request, Madam Chair. Also today, we'll be introducing some amendments to the committee rules. Ultimately, the common thread of these amendments is to ensure the minority has the opportunity for meaningful participation in the majority's endeavors. Provide us notice, consult with us, allow us to have input in the committee's oversight. At a minimum, all of our constituents deserve that. So I ask that you hear us out on these amendments. Even if these amendments are not adopted into our rules, we still hope that you go above and beyond our rules whenever possible to provide us notice and seek our input. We're ready to work with you on behalf of the American people. Madam Chair, I urge you to join us in that effort. We believe in this committee's mission, improving government efficiency and transparency by finding ways to reduce mismanagement, fraud, waste, and abuse. With that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I happen to be in the committee room in Congress right now. But let's please give a warm welcome to all of the Oversight Committee members. Thank you all for joining the committee. I would now like to announce the Congressman Jimmy Gomez from California will be serving once again as Vice Chair. Thank you, Mr. Gomez. I look forward to continuing to work with you in this Congress. Next, I would like to introduce our 5 subcommittee chairs on the majority side. Congressman Lynch will chair the National Security Subcommittee. Congressman Conley will chair the Government Operations Subcommittee. Congressman Krishnamurthy will chair the Economic Consumer Policy Subcommittee. And Congressman Raskin will chair the Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee. And Congressman Ro Khanna will chair the Subcommittee on the Environment. Thank you all for your service. I understand that Ranking Member Comer is not ready to name the subcommittee ranking members yet, which is perfectly fine. We will instead name the subcommittee ranking members at the onset of our hearing this Thursday. I would now like to proceed to the committee rules. The rules package before the committee is the same as last Congress, which I believe worked very well. I won't spend a lot of time on the rules because we should all be familiar with them. I just want to highlight quickly that Rule 6 establishes our 5 subcommittees, which have the same jurisdictions as last Congress. At the request of Congresswoman Norton, jurisdiction over the District of Columbia will stay at the full committee, as will federal records and public access to government information. I know we won't agree on everything, but I truly want to work in a bipartisan, constructive fashion with the minority. If we have disagreements, I encourage all members, majority and minority, to come to me directly and we can try to work them out. So with that, I now recognize Ranking Member Comer for his opening statement on the rules.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And if it's appropriate, I would just like to go ahead and announce that I have an amendment at the desk. If
Fine.
we're ready for that.
Okay.
I have an amendment at the
Yes,
desk.
ma'am. Okay. The clerk will designate the amendment. It's not working.
Amendment to the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Mr. Comer.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read.
All right.
The ranking member is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In 1927, the Supreme Court passed the landmark case McGrain versus Daugherty, which serves as the basis for much of the congressional oversight and investigations we do today. That case was decided in the wake of the Teapot Dome scandal, when a witness refused to comply with a subpoena from a Senate committee investigating the Attorney General for failing to prosecute specific individuals who violated antitrust laws. The Supreme Court decided that Congress indeed has the power of inquiry with process to enforce it, and noted this power is an essential and appropriate auxiliary to the legislative function. It is with this Supreme Court decision in mind that Congress passed passed ruling which is still in effect today. At the time of its passage in 1928, there were 128 different statutes in the federal code requiring agencies to submit information to Congress. Congress repealed those statutes and replaced it with Section 2954, which states, an executive agency on request of the Committee on Government Operations of the House of Representatives or any 7 members thereof, or on request of the Committee on Governmental Affairs of the Senate, or any 5 members thereof, shall submit any information requested of it relating to any matter within the jurisdiction of the committee. As one court noted late last year, Section 2954 ensures that legislators serving on the 2 committees directly responsible for government oversight could more effectively and more timely receive the information from federal agencies that is necessary and useful to their performance of their legislative duties. Madam Chair, we are hopeful that you will work with us in a bipartisan manner on oversight initiatives during this Congress. While I understand the chair of this committee is historically reluctant to send serious inquiries to an executive branch comprised of the same party, following that mold would do a grave disservice to the American people who demand their tax dollars be spent wisely and effectively. There will be times over the next 2 years when we wish to investigate a matter in the executive branch and you bow to the political pressure of the left and refuse to join forces with us. When that happens, and when an agency refuses to cooperate with us in that matter, we fully intend to use the power given to us under federal law to try to extract the necessary information from that agency. And remember, only 7 of us. It could be 7 Republicans, it could be 7 Democrats, it could be a mixture of both, are needed to pursue that path. We both hope and expect to conduct oversight with you over the next 2 years in a bipartisan manner. To the extent you refuse, we will not hesitate to use the 7-member rule as often as needed. In recognition of this important rule, I'm introducing an amendment to memorialize it in our committee rules. And Madam Chair, that would be the Comer Amendment 1.
Thank you,
Aye.
Mr. Comer. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. While I appreciate the ranking member offering this amendment, I strongly support the 7-member rule. I don't believe that this amendment is necessary. The committee rules don't need to restate what is already in the federal law. Our rules are there for us, and there's no reason for them to recognize the validity of federal statutes, especially because the DC Circuit just recognized the validity of the 7-member rule about a month ago. Does this mean that all the sections of the code that we don't recognize in our rules are not valid? Members will certainly be able to exercise the powers afforded to them by US code regardless of what is in the rules. So unfortunately, I have to oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it. Is there any other member who seeks any recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, Mr. Conley is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. First of all, I think the 7-member rule, as you point out, Madam Chairwoman, has most recently, a month ago, been reaffirmed by a federal court. And while I am certainly supportive of the ranking member's assertion of the need to preserve the ability of 7 members of the committee to follow where the facts are, I guess I'd be a little more persuaded if in the 4 years of the Trump administration, there had been Republican cooperation in looking at malfeasance or problematic behavior, of which there was a great deal. We spent 4 years seeing and hearing no evil. And so it is a little difficult to be sympathetic to a plea for investigating a Democratic administration when the very same people making that plea steadfastly resisted any such endeavor in the 4 years of the Trump administration. So I support the chairwoman in opposing this amendment. It is redundant, and I wish we had behaved according to the rhetoric we just heard during this last 4-year very difficult period. Thank you, Chairwoman.
Thank you. Is there any other member who seeks recognition?
Madam Chair,
Yes?
I appreciate what my good friend, Mr. Conley said. First of all, we're glad that the majority party is aware of the recent court ruling. We believe that that will significantly change the ability the minority will have in being able to conduct thorough, meaningful oversight. And secondly, with respect to this newfound interest in overseeing the executive branch, we were always willing to oversee any potential wrongdoing in the last administration, It's just that this committee spent an awful lot of time on issues like Russia and other issues where there clearly was no evidence of wrongdoing. So we hope that this committee will get back to focusing on the abuse with taxpayers, not political, but factual investigation to try to get the backs of the American taxpayer. And that's what we want. That's what this Republican minority Committee on Oversight and Reform seeks to do. We seek to find the truth. We seek to investigate areas of wrongdoing where we have credible evidence and hope that this committee will be a model for this Congress. With that, I yield back and I ask for a recorded vote at the appropriate time on this amendment.
Okay. If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those say aye, all those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A recorded vote has been called. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton,
No.
Mr. Lynch, Mr. Lynch,
No. No, can you hear me?
yes. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper,
No.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly,
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no.
Hello.
Mr. Krishnamurthy,
No.
Is the first of four? First-
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no.
okay,
Mr. Raskin,
Yep.
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna,
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume,
I vote no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez,
No.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib,
No.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter,
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush,
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis, Mr. Davis,
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz,
No.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch,
Votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson, Mr. Johnson,
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes,
No.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear,
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly,
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence,
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier,
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Gomez,
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley,
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer,
Yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan,
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox?
Yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman?
Yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr.
Hey, I
Snow?
gotta give you a suggestion. Why don't we next time roll all 5 together? Just a suggestion.
Thank you. Mr. Cloud?
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace?
Yes.
Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell? Ms. Harrell?
I'm voting yes. Hello, can you hear
Ms.
me?
Harrell, I don't see your video on.
Oh, hold on. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
I
I
vote
can
yes.
see you.
Thank you.
Okay.
I vote
Ms.
yes.
Harrell? Ms. Harrell
Yes.
votes yes. Mr. Donalds?
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
No. The amendment is not agreed to, and the clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 18 ayes and 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments?
Madam Chair.
Mr. Comer, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have one final amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2 to the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Mr. Comer.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The ranking member is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. During the organizational meeting last Congress, the late Chairman Elijah Cumming announced an agreement he had reached with then Ranking Member Jim Jordan. This agreement was about notice and consultation between the chair and the ranking member before the chair issues subpoenas. Last Congress, Chairman Cummings read the agreement in its entirety during the organizational meeting, and I will read it now. Quote, "A congressional subpoena is a powerful and coercive tool It should be used only when attempts to reach an accommodation with a witness are at an impasse or when necessary to obtain certain sensitive information, such as financial information, or through the friendly subpoena to protect a witness. I intend to avoid the use of unilateral subpoenas whenever possible. In the normal course, I hope to work with the ranking member on proposed subpoenas well in advance. I intend to consult with the ranking member by providing his office with a physical copy of the subpoena at least 2 days before it's issued. If the ranking member objects to the issuance of a subpoena in writing, my preference is to bring the subpoena before the committee for a vote when that is feasible. Members deserve the opportunity to go on the record for some of the most important work they will do, and the public deserves the opportunity to see them do that work in the open. The chair prefers that when the ranking member objects, the committee will have an open proceeding and a vote when feasible. There will be exceptions to this policy when, for example, the calendar does not permit the committee to schedule a markup between my initial consultation with the ranking member and the date on which a witness is scheduled to appear. But even in those cases, I intend to be open with the ranking member and give him every opportunity to voice his opinion on the matter, end quote. That is the agreement in its entirety. I think it speaks for itself. But the root of this agreement is the understanding that, one, the subpoena is a powerful tool. Two, a bipartisan subpoena, however, is stronger than a unilateral one. And three, at a minimum, notice and consultation are common sense measures that the majority should afford the minority to the fullest extent possible. And this agreement was honored most of last Congress. And when it was honored, this agreement worked well. But at a certain point, this agreement, Madam Chair, stopped being honored. Therefore, I would now like to introduce an amendment that memorializes this agreement in our committee rules. And that is amendment number 2.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Comer. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Subpoena authority is a significant and serious responsibility. I've committed to exercise subpoena authority effectively and responsibly in the interest of the American people. I've also committed to strive for bipartisanship, reasonable notification, and meaningful consultation with the ranking member before a subpoena is issued. This amendment makes changes to the committee rules that have been in place for years, including the 8 years that Republicans held the majority on this committee. When the Republicans were in the majority, they issued hundreds of subpoenas without a committee vote. But now they're asking us to change the committee rules to give them an authority that they refused to give us during the 8 years we were in the minority. I understand that Mr. Cummings agreed to this orally last Congress, but I will note that Mr. Cummings did not agree to put it in the rules, and neither will I. The American people have made clear that they want this committee to conduct fair and rigorous oversight, and we intend to do that. I oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it. I yield back. Is there other members who seek recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor, say aye.
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 Those opposed, say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, if it would be appropriate, I would ask for a recorded vote because I have a feeling that we're going to video these first 2 amendments and we'll be talking about them at the Rules Committee hearing we have in Congress in the next 2 years because I believe that there'll be a lot of changes. But with that, I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton,
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. If we can ask all members to please mute themselves until your name is called, that would be very helpful. Mr. Lynch,
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper,
Mr. Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly,
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy,
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin,
Raskin votes no.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna,
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume,
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Acacia Cortez,
No.
Ms. Acacia Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib,
No.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter, Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush,
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis,
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz, Wasserman Schultz no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch,
Votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson,
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes,
Votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear,
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly,
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence,
No.
Ms. Kelly, Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSanya,
No.
Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Gomez,
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley,
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer,
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan,
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar,
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox,
Ms. Fox votes yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss, Mr. Grothman,
Yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud,
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs,
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins,
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman,
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Keller,
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs,
Aye. Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde,
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace,
Yes.
Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin,
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. Latourner,
Yes.
Mr. Latourner votes yes. Mr. Fallon,
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell,
Yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds, Mr. Donalds,
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney,
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
The clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 18 ayes, 24 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments?
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment. Without objection, the amendment. Okay. Clerk will designate the amendment. It's the Norman Amendment.
Amendment to the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Mr. Norman.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Norman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As has been discussed by Chairman Comer, Ranking Member Comer, the subpoena is a very powerful tool that's been used. I'm very disappointed that the chairwoman and the majority have been unwilling to restore the agreement on notice and consultation reached last Congress between Chairman Cummings and then Ranking Member Jim Jordan. My amendment simply says and requires the chair to give the ranking member 72-hour notice before issuing a subpoena. As has been said, the subpoena is a powerful resource. I think this is a reasonable request to give, and it should be memorialized. And it's not just respect for the ranking member or the minority members of this committee, but for the American people. We're all elected to the House of Representatives and Congress. We honor, and it's an honor to serve on this committee. And I think it's at a minimum 72 hours gives everyone notice to be able to study the subpoena, do the background work, get the information. And that's basically what my amendment does. This is a powerful tool, and I think this is a small thing to ask. So I submit my amendment. Yield back.
I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. As I have previously stated, I have committed to exercise subpoena authority effectively and responsibly in the interest of the American people. Under the committee rules, members already receive 3 calendar days written notice that a deposition has been scheduled except in emergency circumstances. In addition, when possible, we have attempted to provide more than the required notice of depositions, and we welcome the opportunity to work together in a bipartisan manner on our investigations going forward. So I think this amendment is unnecessary, and I urge my colleagues to vote against it. I yield back. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye. All those
Aye.
opposed say no.
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 In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Madam Chair,
Yes,
I ask for a recorded vote.
a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Norman, if that was you asking for a recorded vote, your video is not on.
Got it on now.
Miss Norton,
No.
Miss Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch,
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper,
Mr. Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly,
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy,
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin, Mr. Khanna,
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume,
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Acacia Cortez,
No.
Ms. Acacia Cortez votes no. Ms. Talib,
No.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Porter,
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush,
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis,
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz,
No.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch,
Votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson,
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes,
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear,
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly,
Kelly votes no.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence,
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSanya,
No.
Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Gomez,
Nope.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley,
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer,
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan,
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox?
I vote yes. There were several votes in a row back there where people didn't show up on the video. Just pointing it out. I vote yes.
I'll get somebody to contact your office to see if they can help you put it in speaker view.
I've got mine on. I see most people, but not all.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman?
Yeah, I'm voting yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Cloud?
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes. I vote yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Miss Mace?
Yes.
Miss Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin?
Franklin, aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Miss Harrell?
Yes.
Miss Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds?
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Miss Maloney?
Mrs. Maloney votes no, and I want to note that Mr. Raskin is now back on and he still needs to vote. I also wanted to remind all members to please turn their videos on when they're speaking and when they're voting so we can see everyone's face, as Mrs. Fox pointed out. Thank you.
Ms. Chair? Madam Chair,
Yes.
it's Jamie Raskin and I vote no. And but my video was actually on and then the whole thing just blinked out.
Okay.
Mr. Raskin votes no.
The clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 24 noes, 18 yeas.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Will the clerk say something else?
The clerk has to designate the Grothman amendment.
Amendment to the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Mr. Grothman.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Grothman is recognized to explain the amendment.
Our committee possesses truly awesome powers. that assist us in uncovering and investigating fraud, waste, and abuse in the federal government. One of those powers is the power to compel testimony of potential witnesses at lengthy depositions. Depositions are important in documenting witnesses' knowledge of all the facts relating to a congressional investigation. Depositions also permit witnesses to provide context and explain information that may well have been received by the committee through other means, such as document productions or information provided by whistleblowers. This awesome power should only be conducted under the supervision of duly elected members of Congress who are accountable to people at the ballot box. Under our committee rules, the chair of the committee, with mere consultation with the ranking member, may order the taking of a deposition under oath and pursuant to notice or subpoena. Objections may be made, which can be ruled on by the chair, and a deponent who refuses to answer questions after being directed by the chair may be subject to sanction. Although depositions may be led in many cases by appropriately designated congressional staff, it is essential that we have an elected member of Congress present during the depositions. In past Congresses, this was widely accepted as a requirement of conducting a deposition, that a member of Congress be present. Yet last Congress, the House and committee rules changed this longstanding practice, eliminating the member requirement. Of course, members may attend depositions. In addition to the witnesses, their consular and official reporter and staff designated by the chair and ranking member. But the deponent, the person whose testimony is compelled, is no longer given the option to require a member. The deponent, we must change this rule back to ensure that a member of Congress be present. Otherwise, we cede the awesome power of this committee to unelected staff. With that, I'm introducing an amendment to reinstate the member requirement for depositions.
Thank you, Mr. Grothman. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I oppose this amendment. If any member of this committee wants to attend a deposition, they can attend the deposition. They don't need the chair's permission. They just show up. To require a member to be present, however, would just limit the committee's ability to do its work efficiently. We can't and won't allow the committee's work to be delayed simply because of scheduling concerns. As members, we're all busy traveling to our districts, voting on the floor, attending other hearings and meetings. Should we stop the work of the committee simply because we are in our districts? I don't think so. That's not what the people elected us to do. They want us to hold their government accountable, and there's so much work to do. That's why I oppose this amendment, and I yield back. If there are any other members who want to speak or who seek recognition, please do so.
Madam Chair?
Yes,
Congressman
you're
Jordan.
recognized. I
Thank
can't
Madam
see you.
Chair.
Yes. Who is this?
Jim Jordan.
Okay, the gentleman, Mr. Jordan is
Well,
recognized.
look, I support the amendment. I mean, first, us talk with us about subpoenas, commit to giving 2 hours notice when you subpoena someone. And now once you've done all that and they come in for a deposition, there's not even going to be a member of Congress there for the deposition itself. So this is pretty basic. It's a good amendment. Mr. Grothman makes a lot of sense with what he's offering here. And this was the pattern for so many years when Republicans were in control of the committee. I hope you reconsider, and I hope the committee will adopt the gentleman's fine amendment.
Is there any other person, any other member who seeks recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no.
No,
In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, could I ask for a recorded vote and roll this in with the amendment number 6?
We cannot roll votes. We have to take them now. Do you request a recorded vote now?
Sure.
Okay, a recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton,
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
No.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no.
Yeah, hold on.
Mr. Khanna?
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
No.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib?
No.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch?
Votes no. Thank you.
Votes no. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly is a nay.
Ms. Kelly votes no.
In December, we successfully worked with the foster youth advocacy groups, both parties.
Ms. Lawrence?
Programs and services.
Ms. Lawrence votes no.
Foster care program for successful.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier?
No.
Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Gomez?
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley?
Presley votes no.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr.
Yes.
Gosar
Yes.
votes yes. Ms. Fox?
Yes, and I will have an amendment. It'll be number 6.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman?
Sorry.
Mr. Grothman?
Yes. Yes,
Mr.
I vote
Grothman
yes.
votes yes. Mr. Cloud?
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde,
Aye.
Mr. Clyde votes, Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Mace, Ms. Mace,
Yes. Yes.
Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin,
Franklin, aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. Latourner,
Yes.
Mr. Latourner votes yes. Mr. Fallon,
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell,
Yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds,
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney,
Ms. Maloney votes no. The clerk will report.
on this vote, we have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments?
Madam Chair, I have a amendment at the desk. This
The
is
clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the Rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Mr. Cloud.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Cloud is recognized to explain the amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And let me first begin by echoing the comments from the ranking member on the benefit this would be to, as best as possible, have these hearings in person or at a minimum hybrid, where some of us can attend in person. Our role in this committee is very simple. Regardless of party, it's to oversee the government. In this last meeting in Congress, the newly minted majority in the last session removed government from the title of this committee. When we were in charge, and historically this committee has been called the Committee for House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. And that was changed in the last term. My amendment would simply add the term government back in it. I think it begs the question that if we are not reforming government, what are we trying to reform? I think it's important for us to recognize our responsibility for oversight on behalf of the people, but also recognize the limitations of the authority which has been delegated to us by the people. This would help just keep that focus in our committee. Now, obviously, this didn't then and doesn't now mean we cannot investigate other matters, certainly bad actors, especially when there's a direct federal nexus. But removing the name government from the committee suggests to everyone that the aperture of this committee with the broadest investigative journalism is no longer primarily interested in the government, especially in a cancel culture that's begun to limit free speech and create lists of political dissenters. And in light of how this committee in the past has been used in the last term to discriminate or to disseminate narratives ultimately proven to have no evidentiary basis, we need to assure the American public that this committee is not going to pursue investigations into people's businesses and into people who just politically we disagree with. This committee has a big enough a task to oversee government and the politics and policies, I should say, of government that we need to oversee. We should be examining unprecedented exercise of executive power, the 42 executive actions in the first day of the Biden administration, and see if those have been truly beneficial to our country. Some of these, including killing off the XL pipeline, has cost many jobs at a time of high employment in our nation. Revoking the Mexico City policy, which in a time of we need to be fiscally restraint, sends American taxpayer dollars to pay for other people's abortions in other countries. Last Congress in this committee, we had one of the most productive meetings I've ever been a part of in Congress when we held a hearing on the Government Accountability Office's high risk list. We examined the GAO's suggestions. We asked for historical perspective. We sought answers on critical questions about these government functions. And as you know, every 2 years, the GAO issues their high risk series that identifies government programs most susceptible to waste, fraud, and abuse. The GAO recommends in their report that Congress and the executive branch act on literally hundreds of recommendations. Many of these recommendations have gone unaddressed. We're not making progress on them. Some we're actually going backwards on. For example, the USPS financial viability continues to be on the list, most notably because Congress, and in particular this committee, continues to just bail them out and kick the can down the road. That's a really important discussion to make, and we've had some bipartisan movement on that in the past, but we just haven't been able to make the ends meet, so to speak. A critical part of the GAO notes in the report that where there has been improvement in high-risk areas, congressional actions have been critical in spurring that progress. So we have a lot of potential here should we address these issues that have come to light in the high-risk list. We should listen to that advice and act on it. I would respectfully ask that we hold more of these types of hearings. The GAO report would serve well as an agenda for this committee. And I would respectfully ask that my colleagues join me in supporting this amendment and add government back to the title of this committee to reassure the American people that this committee's primary focus is on reforming government. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cloud. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Our committee has always examined both government and private sector issues under both Republican and Democratic chairs. The committee's name, which was changed last Congress in the House rules, not the committee rules, the House rules, simply acknowledges that fact. Adopting this amendment would also put the committee's rules in conflict with the House rules, which is nonsensical. This amendment seeks to limit the committee's work to oversight of the government while allowing the private sector to operate unchecked. This is not in the interest of the American people. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote against it. I yield back. Is there any other members who seek recognition?
Madam Chairwoman.
Mr. Conley's recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I want to associate myself with your remarks. If we adopt this amendment, I assume unwittingly, we tie one hand behind our back. After the pandemic, we're going to want to look at a wide range of both private and public sector activities that impinged on our response to this pandemic and the economic fallout. We've had private sector hearings on pharmaceutical companies. We've had private sector hearings on Planned Parenthood. We have had private sector hearings on technology and technology companies and facial recognition technologies. To limit ourselves only to something strictly governmental, I think defeats the whole purpose of the broad work of the Oversight and Reform Committee. I oppose the amendment and I associate myself with your remarks. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
The gentleman yields back. If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye. Aye.
All those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, I ask for recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
No.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna?
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
No.
Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Tlaib?
Tlaib votes no.
Ms. Tlaib votes no. Ms. Porter? Ms. Porter? I can see you, Ms. Porter, but I can't hear you.
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis?
Davis votes no.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
Wasserman Schultz votes no.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch? Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes votes no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly votes nay.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
Lawrence votes no.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSagne?
No.
Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez?
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley?
No.
Ms. Presley votes no. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox?
Ms. Fox votes yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman?
Yes.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud?
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace?
Yes.
Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. Latourner?
Yes.
Mr. Latourner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell?
Yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds?
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
The clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 23
How am I recorded?
noes.
This is Congressman Welch. How am I recorded?
Mr. Welch, how do you, or how are you recorded?
Mr. Welch is not recorded.
Mr. Welch votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no.
The clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 24 noes, 18 yeas.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there other amendments?
Madam Chair, this is Virginia Fox. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform offered by Ms. Fox.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read. Mrs. Fox is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Last Congress, the committee changed the committee rules to allow the chair to unilaterally waive or modify any of the privilege requirements. The minority objected to this ability to unilaterally waive them, and we continue to do so. Quite frankly, our experience the past 2 years has only underscored our objection and why this amendment should be adopted. Last Congress, our majority counterparts at times abused their oversight authority, which led to significant losses in the courts and an erosion of our Article I authority. In fact, the validity of Rule 16 in the committee's current rules is in question. The Supreme Court ruled in Trump versus Mazur's case that recipients of congressional subpoenas, quote, retain their constitutional rights and various privileges throughout the course of an investigation. The House Democrats were short-sighted when they risked our oversight authority, putting the legal underpinnings of Rule 16 in flux. So if there are going to be comprehensive privilege requirements, for now, it is imperative there be a fair process in setting the privilege requirements and ruling on such assertions. Further, the fact that the chair is granting herself unilateral authority to waive or modify the privilege requirements is problematic. Privilege issues are especially important to this committee, given its jurisdiction and oversight work. This should be a shared responsibility and should not reside with one person, especially without consultation from the ranking member and his colleagues. Therefore, we should strike the part of Rule 16 granting the chair the authority to unilaterally waive or modify privilege requirements. I yield back.
Thank you, Mrs. Fox. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Good oversight comes from transparency and efficiency. In order to do the work of this committee, we have to have information, and to get information, we need witnesses and documents. Sometimes, in order to obtain information in a timely manner, we might need to make some reasonable accommodations. This rule simply allows for that process to take place. My colleagues have not demonstrated a need for this amendment. This provision was in our committee rules last Congress, and it was not used even once. So I don't think this is a problem that needs to be addressed. Our goal is to obtain the information necessary to carry out our legislative and oversight responsibilities, and this rule will help us do that. I oppose this amendment and urge my colleagues to vote against it. I yield back. Is there any other member who seeks recognition? If no one else seeks recognition, the question is on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
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 All those opposed say no. No.
No. No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Madam Chair, on that, request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Lynch?
Mr. Lynch votes no.
Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper?
Cooper votes no.
Mr. Cooper votes no. Mr. Connolly?
No.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy?
Nope.
Mr. Krishnamurthy votes no. Mr. Raskin?
No.
Mr. Raskin votes no. Mr. Khanna?
No.
Mr. Khanna votes no. Mr. Mfume?
Mr. Mfume votes no.
Mr. Mfume votes no. Ms. Ocasio-Cortez?
No.
Ms. Ocasio-Cortez votes no. Ms. Talib?
Talib votes no.
Ms. Talib votes no. Ms. Porter?
No.
Ms. Porter votes no. Ms. Bush?
No.
Ms. Bush votes no. Mr. Davis?
No.
Mr. Davis votes no. Ms. Wasserman Schultz? Ms. Wasserman Schultz?
No.
Ms. Wasserman Schultz votes no. Mr. Welch?
Votes no.
Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Johnson?
Johnson votes no.
Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Sarbanes?
Sarbanes is no.
Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Ms. Spear?
No.
Ms. Spear votes no. Ms. Kelly?
Kelly is a nay.
Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence?
Ms. Lawrence votes nay.
Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. DeSagne?
No.
Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez? Mr. Gomez?
No.
Mr. Gomez votes no. Ms. Presley?
No.
Ms. Presley votes no.
Did you get me?
Mr. Comer?
No.
Yes. I
Comer,
heard. Mr. Comer?
Comer votes yes.
Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes.
No.
I don't know.
No.
Mr. Gomez, yes, we have you as no. Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Gosar?
Yes.
Mr. Gosar votes yes. Ms. Fox?
Yes.
Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Grothman?
Yep.
Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Cloud?
Yes.
Mr. Cloud votes yes. Mr. Gibbs?
Yes.
Mr. Gibbs votes yes. Mr. Higgins?
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Norman?
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mr. Sessions? Mr. Keller?
Yes.
Mr. Keller votes yes. Mr. Biggs?
Aye.
Mr. Biggs votes yes. Mr. Clyde?
Aye.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Ms. Mace?
Yes.
Ms. Mace votes yes. Mr. Franklin?
Aye.
Mr. Franklin votes yes. Mr. LaTurner?
Yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Fallon?
Yes.
Mr. Fallon votes yes. Ms. Harrell?
Yes.
Ms. Harrell votes yes. Mr. Donalds?
Yes.
Mr. Donalds votes yes. Ms. Maloney?
No.
Ms. Maloney votes no.
Okay, the clerk will report.
On this vote, we have 24 noes and 18 yeas.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? If there are no further amendments, I move that the proposed rules be adopted as the rules of the Committee on Oversight and Reform for the 117th Congress. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those, Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it and the proposed rules are adopted. The clerk will report the tally. The rules are adopted and without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to House rules, the rules adopted by the Committee on Oversight and Reform for the 117th Congress will be published in the Congressional Record and made available to all members and the public on the committee's website. Our last order of business is officially naming the subcommittee chairs and the full committee vice chair. I ask unanimous consent that the resolution naming the 5 subcommittee chairs and the full committee vice chair is approved. Without objection, so ordered. This concludes today's business meeting. Without objection, committee staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to reflect the action of the committee in adopting the resolution embodying our rules. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.